In the final part of today's lecture, I want to talk a little bit about some more advanced materials, about some other ways that we can use imitation learning to solve interesting decision-making and control problems. So this other imitation idea that I'm going to talk about deals with how data that is not necessarily optimal for one task could be optimal for another one, and how we can leverage that observation for imitation learning. So let's say that you have a trajectory for your agent that reached some point P1, right? So if you have many trajectories that all reach P1, that's good. You can use those trajectories with imitation learning and learn how to reach P1. But what if you have a bunch of demonstrations that all reach different points? One of them reached P1, another one reached P2, another one reached P3. Now the trouble is that you might not have enough demonstrations for any one of those points by itself. So maybe if you just use the demonstrations for P1, you won't actually be able to learn to reach P1 successfully. What if you condition your policy on the point that was reached? Now, even if you have just a single demonstration for each point, you can learn a conditional policy, kind of amounts to just appending P to the state, and that conditional policy would then be able to reach any point, including P1. So in this way, by conditioning your policy on additional information, you can actually train policies for performing some task, even if you didn't have enough data for that task. There are a number of works that have used this idea in one form or another that I want to tell you about briefly. So we're going to call this goal-conditioned behavior cloning. And during training, we'll observe a bunch of demonstrations that in general all do different things. But then we're going to treat each demonstration as a successful example for doing whatever it is that that demonstration actually succeeded at. So if the demonstration reached the state ST, it's a successful demonstration for reaching ST. And then we'll learn a policy, condition on a state, and condition on the goal. So the way that this works is that for each demo, you basically select the goal to be the last state that was reached, and then just do regular behavior cloning. This idea has been used in a few papers. Here are a couple of examples. I'm going to actually talk about the first one, called Learning Latent Plans from Play. And the idea in this paper was to collect data from human demonstrators that are not doing anything in particular, but are actually just attempting a wide range of different behaviors. Then this data is processed to essentially select the last state as a goal. The actual model architecture in this paper is a little bit complicated for the reasons that I described earlier in the lecture. Essentially, in order for this to work, the imitation needs to be very powerful. It needs to match the expert very accurately, which means it has to deal with multimodality and non-Markovian problems. The way that it does this is actually by using a combination of autoregressive discretization and a latent variable model. So if you remember, in a latent variable model, we feed an additional noise input into the policy, and that noise input allows us to represent arbitrary output distributions. So it's kind of a more sophisticated imitation learning architecture, but the overall algorithm follows the scheme that I had on the previous slide. And once this policy is trained, it can actually reach a variety of different goals. So here, the image on the left shows the goal, and the video on the right shows the policy actually trying to reach that goal. And this is a single policy trained on a wide variety of different training data. Now, another idea that we could imagine from watching these results is that, well, if we don't need demonstrations to be successful at a single specific task, but we can instead use demonstrations from a wide range of different tasks with this conditioning trick, do we even need them to be demonstrations at all? Could we instead maybe get bad random data and use that random data as demonstrations? So basically, if you have a bad trajectory, but that trajectory reached some state, maybe it's actually a good trajectory for whatever state it reached. And that's actually the algorithm described in this paper called Learning to Reach Goals via Iterative Supervised Learning, where the overall recipe is to actually start from scratch. There's no human data at all. Instead, we start with a random policy. That random policy collects random data, but then that random data is relabeled with whatever goal that it reached. So if your random trajectory reached state ST, then it's a good demonstration for the goal ST. That is then used to retrain the policy, which gives you a better policy for reaching goals that is better than random, and then you repeat. And it can actually be shown that repeating this process can actually solve some pretty sophisticated reinforcement learning tasks just with an inner loop imitation learning procedure and this relabeling stage.